My wife faked a pregnancy to save our marriage, so I confronted her in front of her family at the baby shower. I'm 32, and 3 weeks ago I discovered that my wife of 4 years had been faking a pregnancy for 7 months to keep me from filing for divorce. What she didn't know was that I'd been planning to leave her long before she announced the pregnancy, and her desperate lie only made me more determined to expose the truth in the most devastating way possible. My name is Tyler, and this is about how I learned that sometimes the person you love most is capable of the cruelest deception imaginable. Let me start by saying that I genuinely loved my wife Michelle when we got married. We met in college during our senior year, dated for 3 years after graduation, and I thought we had everything figured out. She was working toward her teaching certification, I was climbing the ladder at an engineering firm, and we had these long talks about our future together. Kids by 30, a house in the suburbs with a big backyard, maybe a golden retriever. All the normal stuff that young couples dream about when they think love conquers everything. The problems started about 2 years into our marriage, though I didn't recognize them as serious problems at first. Michelle had always been what you'd call emotionally intense, but after we got married it transformed into something more demanding. She'd have complete emotional breakdowns over things that seemed minor to me forgetting to pick up milk on the way home, working late without calling first, or choosing to watch a game instead of a romantic movie. At first, I thought it was just stress from her new position teaching 3rd grade, so I tried to be more understanding and accommodating. But it kept escalating in ways that made me uncomfortable. She'd accuse me of not caring about her if I wanted to grab drinks with my college friends on Friday nights. She'd cry if I didn't respond to her text within 30 minutes, claiming I was ignoring her on purpose. She started going through my phone when I was in the shower, checking my email while I was at work, even calling my office to verify that I was actually there when I said I was. When I tried to talk to her about needing some personal space and independence, she'd break down completely and say I was abandoning her just like her father had when she was 12. Michelle's dad had walked out on their family when she was in middle school, and I understood that experience had affected her deeply. I really tried to be patient and supportive, to show her through my actions that I wasn't going anywhere, that our marriage was solid, and she didn't need to worry about me leaving. But nothing I did seemed to be enough. She needed constant reassurance, constant attention, constant proof that I loved her and wasn't secretly planning to escape. It was absolutely exhausting trying to manage her emotions on top of my own life and career. The breaking point came about 8 months ago when my company assigned me to lead a project that required some regional travel. Nothing major, maybe 2 or 3 days per month visiting client sites in neighboring states. Michelle completely lost it when I told her about the assignment. She accused me of having an affair, of using work as an excuse to get away from her, of actively seeking opportunities that would take me away from our marriage. The fight lasted for hours, with her crying and screaming while I tried calmly to explain that this was an important career opportunity, that the travel was temporary, and that I loved her and wasn't trying to escape our relationship. But then she said something that fundamentally changed how I saw our marriage. In the middle of her breakdown, she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and said, "You can't leave me, Tyler. I won't let you. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you here." The way she said it, the desperate look in her eyes, the possessive grip on my arm, it genuinely scared me. This wasn't about love anymore. This was about control, about ownership, about her need to possess me rather than partner with me. I realized that Michelle didn't see me as her husband or her equal. She saw me as something she owned, something she had to prevent from escaping no matter what it cost either of us. That night, lying awake while she slept fitfully beside me, I started thinking seriously about divorce for the first time in our marriage. I loved Michelle deeply, but I couldn't continue living like this. I couldn't be responsible for managing another adult's emotions 24 hours a day. I couldn't keep walking on eggshells in my own home, afraid that any small decision or normal life event would trigger another emotional crisis that would consume our entire evening. I started researching divorce lawyers and marriage counselors, trying to figure out if there was any realistic way to save what we had. I even suggested couples therapy to Michelle during one of our calmer moments, thinking maybe a professional could help her understand that her behavior was pushing me away. But she refused completely, getting defensive and angry. She said there was nothing wrong with our marriage that couldn't be fixed if I just tried harder to understand her needs and be more considerate of her feelings. That response told me everything I needed to know. Michelle couldn't see that her behavior was the problem. In her mind, I was the one who needed to change, to give more, to sacrifice more of myself to make her feel secure. She had no interest in examining her own actions or getting help for what was clearly becoming a serious mental health issue. That's when I knew our marriage was truly over. I spent the next few months planning my exit strategy. I consulted with a divorce attorney to understand my options and timeline. I started setting aside money in a separate account for my own apartment and living expenses. I researched rental properties in different parts of the city, places where I could start fresh without constant reminders of our failed relationship. I was planning to have the divorce conversation with Michelle after my work project finished in late February, giving us both some time to process and plan for the separation. Then, on Valentine's Day, she told me she was pregnant. I should have been overjoyed. We'd been trying to have children for over a year, and Michelle had been devastated every month when her period arrived. She'd cry for days, talking about how she was failing as a woman, how maybe she wasn't meant to be a mother. I'd comfort her and tell her we just needed to be patient, that it would happen when the time was right. But something about the timing felt suspicious. She'd been extra clingy lately, almost desperate in the way she'd been demanding my attention and affection. She'd been bringing up the idea of having children more frequently, talking about how a baby would bring us closer together and give us something meaningful to focus on. And now, just when I was emotionally pulling away and preparing to leave, she was suddenly pregnant? I pushed those doubts aside and tried to be supportive and excited. Maybe this was exactly what our marriage needed. Maybe becoming parents would help Michelle feel more secure and give her something productive to focus on besides her fears about me leaving. Maybe the responsibility of raising a child together would force us both to grow up and address our problems constructively. For the first few weeks after Michelle's announcement, things actually seemed to improve between us. She was excited about the baby, spending hours online researching pregnancy symptoms and baby development. She made lists of potential names, bookmarked nursery furniture websites, and talked constantly about how our lives would change once we became parents. She seemed calmer and more stable than she'd been in months, less focused on monitoring my every move and more focused on preparing for our future as a family. I started thinking maybe I'd been too hasty about wanting a divorce. Maybe Michelle's insecurity and controlling behavior had been driven by her fear that we weren't building something permanent together. Now that we were having a baby, maybe she'd feel more secure in our relationship and wouldn't need to constantly test my commitment to her. But then I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up, details that made me question whether everything was as straightforward as it seemed. Michelle claimed she was experiencing severe morning sickness, too nauseous to eat breakfast before work. But I'd find empty cereal bowls and coffee cups in the sink when I got home in the evening, suggesting she was eating normally once I left the house. She said her doctor had advised her to avoid strenuous exercise, but she never seemed to gain any weight despite claiming she was eating larger portions to nourish the baby. Her body looked exactly the same as it always had, with no visible changes despite supposedly being several months pregnant. When I suggested coming to one of her prenatal appointments, she always had a convenient excuse for why that wouldn't work. The appointments were during my busiest work hours, or the doctor had rescheduled at the last minute, or she wanted to handle the early visits alone until we knew everything was progressing normally. She'd come home with generic pregnancy pamphlets that looked like they'd been downloaded from the internet rather than provided by an actual medical practice. The biggest red flag came around what Michelle claimed was her 12-week mark. Her sister Rebecca was visiting for the weekend, and they were looking at pregnancy websites together, comparing symptoms and discussing baby preparations. Rebecca had 2 young children of her own, so she was excited to share her experiences and give Michelle advice about what to expect. With my first pregnancy, I was showing a little bump by 10 weeks, Rebecca mentioned casually. And the morning sickness was absolutely brutal for the first trimester. I couldn't keep anything down. But you seem to be handling everything so well, Michelle. You're lucky. I watched Michelle's face carefully during this conversation, and I could see something that looked like panic flash across her features. She got defensive immediately, her voice taking on that sharp edge it got when she felt cornered. Every pregnancy is completely different, Rebecca. My doctor says everything is progressing perfectly normally for my body type and health history. But when Rebecca asked follow-up questions about which doctor she was seeing and which practice she was going to, Michelle became vague and evasive. She mumbled something about a new OB-GYN practice across town that specialized in high-risk pregnancies, somewhere none of us had ever heard of despite living in the same city for years. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something was fundamentally wrong with this situation, and I needed to understand what it was. Michelle was lying next to me, breathing deeply in what seemed like peaceful sleep, but I felt like I was sleeping next to a stranger. How well did I really know the woman I'd married? What was she capable of if she felt desperate enough? I started paying much closer attention to Michelle's behavior over the following weeks, and the more I watched, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. She claimed to have morning sickness, but it only seemed to manifest when I was around to witness it. If I left for work early and came back unexpectedly to grab something I'd forgotten, I'd find her eating breakfast normally, looking perfectly healthy. If I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, she'd already be awake, sometimes reading pregnancy websites on her phone with an intensity that seemed more like research than casual browsing. The doctor visits continued to be problematic. Michelle always scheduled them during my work hours, and when I offered to take time off to accompany her to important appointments, she'd get emotional and accuse me of being controlling and not trusting her to handle her own medical care. She'd return home with generic pregnancy information and vague updates about how everything was progressing normally, but never any specific details about measurements, test results, or medical recommendations. But what really convinced me something was wrong was her physical appearance. I know that sounds terrible, like I was scrutinizing my wife's body and judging her for not looking pregnant enough. But I lived with this woman. I knew her body as well as I knew my own. And after 4 months of supposed pregnancy, she looked exactly the same as she always had. No weight gain, no changes in her shape or posture, no physical signs whatsoever that she was carrying a child. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid and suspicious for no good reason. Maybe Michelle was just one of those women who didn't show early in their pregnancies. Maybe the stress and excitement of expecting our first child was making her behavior seem strange when it was actually perfectly normal. Maybe I was looking for problems because I'd been planning to leave her anyway, and part of me wanted to find a reason to doubt this pregnancy that was keeping us together. But then I found the pregnancy tests, and everything became horribly clear. I was looking for something in Michelle's dresser drawer when I found a small shoebox hidden under her winter sweaters. Inside were at least a dozen pregnancy tests, all showing negative results. But there was also something else that made my stomach drop, a positive test that looked different from all the others. When I examined it closely under the bedroom lamp, I could see where someone had carefully drawn a second line with a pink marker, creating the appearance of a positive result. My hands were shaking as I put everything back exactly where I'd found it, making sure not to disturb anything that might alert Michelle to my discovery. She had faked a positive pregnancy test. She was lying about being pregnant, had been lying for months, and I had no idea how far she was planning to take this deception or what she thought would happen when the supposed due date arrived. I spent the next week in a weird state of shock and disbelief. I'd go to work and try to act normal, participating in meetings and responding to emails while my mind raced with questions about what Michelle was planning. Then I'd come home to find her talking excitedly about baby names and nursery themes, showing me pregnancy apps on her phone that tracked our baby's development week by week. She'd read me articles about child development and started discussing her plans for maternity leave from teaching. The worst part was watching her family get emotionally invested in this lie. Michelle's mom had already started knitting tiny baby blankets and booties. Her sister Rebecca was planning an elaborate baby shower and had begun shopping for gifts. Everyone was so genuinely happy for us, congratulating me at family dinners and asking about how I felt about becoming a father. I sat through these conversations knowing it was all built on a massive deception that was going to devastate everyone involved. During one particularly painful dinner at her parents' house, Michelle's mom pulled me aside to share her excitement about becoming a grandmother. She talked about how she'd always dreamed of this moment, how she'd saved some of Michelle's baby clothes hoping to use them for her grandchildren someday. The pure joy in her eyes made me feel sick to my stomach, knowing that I was sitting on information that would shatter her happiness completely. I knew I had to confront Michelle about what I'd discovered, but I also knew she'd been planning this lie for months. She'd thought through every detail, prepared responses for every question I might ask. If I confronted her privately, she'd just manufacture another explanation, maybe even claim she'd miscarried to explain why there would be no baby. She was already demonstrating that she was capable of elaborate deception when she felt desperate enough. I also considered the possibility that Michelle might escalate her lies if cornered privately. What if she claimed I was abusing her? What if she threatened to hurt herself? What if she found some other way to manipulate the situation and make me the villain? I'd already seen how far she was willing to go to control our relationship, and I couldn't predict what she might do if she felt her carefully constructed deception was about to collapse. That's when I started planning something that I knew would sound cruel and vindictive to anyone who heard about it later. Michelle's family had been enthusiastically pushing for a baby shower, and she'd finally agreed to let them organize one. The date was set for a Saturday in late July, when she would supposedly be about 7 months pregnant. Her mom, her sister Rebecca, her Aunt Patricia, and several close family friends were all planning to attend. Michelle was excited about it, talking about how meaningful it would be to celebrate with the women who mattered most to her. I decided that's where I would expose her deception. I know exactly how that decision sounds. I know it seems unnecessarily cruel to humiliate her in front of her entire family instead of handling it privately. But I was consumed with anger, not just about the fake pregnancy, but about everything that had led to this moment. The manipulation, the emotional control, the complete disregard for my feelings and autonomy. Michelle had been willing to fake a pregnancy to trap me in a marriage I desperately wanted to leave. She'd been willing to let her entire family get emotionally invested in a grandchild that didn't exist, all to serve her own desperate need to control me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that a public confrontation was actually the most honest approach. Michelle had made this a public lie, involving her entire family in her deception. They deserved to know the truth, and they deserved to hear it from me rather than discovering it later when no baby appeared. If I handled this privately, Michelle would probably just create another lie to explain the absence of a child, and her family would never understand what had really happened. She'd made her choice to deceive everyone who loved her. Now I was going to make mine. I spent the next few weeks methodically gathering evidence. I took photos of the fake pregnancy test with my phone, being careful to capture the marker lines that created the false positive result. I called the medical practice Michelle claimed to be visiting and confirmed they had no record of her as a patient. I even conducted a small test, buying a pregnancy test and leaving it where she'd find it, then watching her take it into the bathroom and emerge claiming it showed positive results when I knew she hadn't had enough time to actually use it properly. During this time, Michelle seemed to be getting more confident in her deception, becoming bolder with her lies. She started talking about feeling the baby kick, even placing my hand on her fake belly and claiming I should be able to feel movement. She showed me ultrasound photos she'd downloaded from the internet, claiming they were from her latest appointment. The depth of her deception was staggering, and it reinforced my belief that she would never voluntarily admit the truth. 3 days before the baby shower, I made one final attempt to give Michelle an opportunity to come clean voluntarily. I asked her directly if there was anything she needed to tell me about the pregnancy, anything she wanted to discuss before we celebrated with her family. She looked me straight in the eye with complete sincerity and said, "Everything is perfect, honey. Our baby is healthy and growing exactly as the doctor expected." That blatant lie, delivered with such conviction while she knew I was specifically giving her a chance to tell the truth, convinced me there was no going back from what I was planning to do. The baby shower was held at Michelle's mom's house, the same place where we'd celebrated our wedding reception 4 years earlier. About 15 women were there, all excited to celebrate the upcoming arrival of our first child. Michelle's mom had decorated with pink and blue streamers, and there was an elaborate cake shaped like a baby carriage with our supposed due date written in frosting. Walking into that house, seeing all the decorations and gifts, knowing that everyone there had spent time and money celebrating something that didn't exist, made me feel physically ill. But I also felt a strange sense of resolution. This deception had gone on long enough, and it was time for the truth to come out. Michelle was playing her role perfectly. She'd ordered a fake pregnancy belly online and was wearing it under a flowing maternity dress. She was glowing with happiness, graciously accepting congratulations and gifts, talking animatedly about how excited she was to become a mother and how supportive I'd been throughout her pregnancy. Watching her lie so effortlessly to people who loved and trusted her completely made me feel physically sick. I noticed how naturally the deception came to her, how she perfected every gesture and response. When someone asked about nursery plans, she had detailed answers ready. When they discussed baby names, she had favorites picked out for both genders. She'd even practiced walking and sitting differently to accommodate her fake belly. The level of preparation and commitment to this lie was honestly impressive in its thoroughness. I waited until after they'd finished playing the traditional baby shower games and opened most of the gifts. Michelle was sitting in the center of the living room, surrounded by piles of baby clothes, toys, and nursery items, looking happier and more content than I'd seen her in months. That's when I stood up and cleared my throat. "I have something important I need to say to everyone," I announced. The room went quiet, probably expecting me to give some touching speech about how grateful I was for their support and how excited I was to become a father. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started reading from the notes I'd carefully prepared. 7 months ago, Michelle told me she was pregnant. I was thrilled to become a father, and I've spent months preparing for our child's arrival. But 3 weeks ago, I discovered something that changed everything. Michelle's face went completely white. She started to stand up from her chair, but I continued talking before she could interrupt. "Michelle isn't pregnant. She's been faking this entire pregnancy to prevent me from filing for divorce." The room erupted in shocked gasps and confused shouting. Michelle's mom started demanding to know what was wrong with me, how I could say such a horrible thing about my own wife. Rebecca was asking if I'd lost my mind, suggesting that maybe I was having some kind of mental breakdown. Several other women began talking at once, some defending Michelle and others asking for clarification. But Michelle just sat there frozen, staring at me with an expression of pure terror. I showed them the photos on my phone, the negative pregnancy tests, the fake positive test with visible marker lines. I explained about the medical practice that had no record of her as a patient, about the downloaded ultrasound photos, about all the small inconsistencies I'd noticed over the months. I pointed out that Michelle had no actual medical documentation of her pregnancy, no legitimate doctor's notes, no real proof of any kind. Michelle has been lying to all of us for 7 months, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. She's let you buy gifts, plan celebrations, and get emotionally invested in a grandchild that doesn't exist. She's done it all to manipulate me into staying in a marriage I've been trying to leave. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the pieces clicking together in their minds, the realization dawning that everything they'd been celebrating was built on a lie. Michelle's mom sank into a chair, her face crumpling as she processed what I just revealed. Michelle finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. Tyler, please don't do this. We can work this out. I can explain everything if you'll just give me a chance. But I was completely done listening to her explanations and promises. The only thing I want from you now is a divorce. I left the party with Michelle's family still shouting questions and accusations, still trying to process what they'd just learned. Michelle followed me to the driveway, crying and begging me not to leave her, promising she'd get help and that we could start over. But I got in my car and drove away without looking back. The aftermath has been brutal but also strangely liberating. Michelle's been calling and texting constantly, alternating between desperate apologies and angry accusations. Her family is completely divided about how to respond. Some blame me for the public humiliation, while others are horrified by the extent of Michelle's deception. But for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe freely. The weight of living with someone else's lies and manipulations has been lifted from my shoulders. I filed for divorce the following week. What Michelle did wasn't just a lie, it was a fundamental betrayal of everything marriage is supposed to represent. I couldn't have stayed with someone capable of that level of calculated deception, no matter what her reasons were. Some people think I was too harsh, that I should have handled it privately. But Michelle had shown me she was willing to deceive everyone who loved her to get what she wanted. Sometimes the only way to stop someone from continuing harmful behavior is to expose it completely, even if that feels cruel. I'm rebuilding my life now, one based on honesty instead of manipulation. And I finally understand that love shouldn't feel like being trapped.